Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon. Hi, everybody. It's not on? What were you told? You've got the switch for it. Have you got the switch for it? Is it on now? Okay. Hi. Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Clutton-Brock. He comes to us from Cambridge University, where he was, until very recently, the Prince Philip Professor of Evolution and Ecology in the Department of Zoology. He also holds a professorship at the University of Pretoria in South Africa and is a fellow of Magdalen College. Professor Clutton-Brock was elected to as a fellow of the Royal Society in 1987, and in 2012 he won the very prestigious Darwin Medal for his contributions to our understandings of animal societies and our understanding of sexual selection and population dynamics. His early work was on the social behavior of non-human primates, but starting in the 1970s, he started these really remarkable long-term studies. First of all, his work on red deer on the island of Rum, and then subsequently work on Soay sheep. More recently, he co-founded the Kalahari Meerkat Project, whose subject featured in an Animal Planet TV documentary called Meerkat Manor, through which people all over the world can keep up with the births and deaths of their favorite meerkat and their social shenanigans. And this also provides funding for some of Tim's work. So I've had the privilege of working in Tim's research group, the Large Animal Research Group in Cambridge, in the early 1980s. And it was a famous group for its extremely dynamic and lively lunchtime discussions. People would come from all over the university to listen to our debates on biology and many other topics. And it's with huge pleasure that I introduce Tim to you today to talk about the origins of society. Welcome, Tim.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here today, and many thanks to Monique and Tim for bringing me, and particularly to Monique for organizing all those lunches in Cambridge so many years ago. I ought just to start and say thank you very much to my collaborators. Dieter Lucas has worked with me for some time and has been responsible for most of the quantitative comparative work. Elise Huchard and Alex Thornton have worked for me on the South African project, and so has Marta Manser. These are the other people who have contributed to this talk and to the background for it. Now, if we look at crowds of humans, we may see them as a crowd, but we actually know that they're all individuals. And we actually know that they all have their places and their roles in society, and they do different things in different circumstances, and they're part of a structural process of relationships that build up to structure the social system that individuals live in. Until comparatively recently, people saw animals as populations rather than as structured societies. By comparatively recently, I've been around long enough to mean that until about 40 or 50 years ago, people tended to see animals as populations, not as societies. But actually, animals live in societies, and they live in societies with contrasting structures, with groups of different stabilities and different sizes, where individuals have contrasting relationships between them. And you see this in particular once you start to be able to identify individuals. And throughout my life, I've worked on a number of projects which have learnt to identify large numbers of individuals and follow them throughout their lifetimes. So in my career, I worked principally on 4 species: red deer, which are the same species, or sometimes they're different species, as your elk; Soay sheep on the island of St Kilda, another polygynous species; and then 2 species of social mongooses, meerkats in the Kalahari, the stars of Meerkat Manor, and banded mongooses in Uganda. Meerkats being cooperative breeders with a single breeding female and then a caste of non-breeding helpers that raise the young. Banded mongooses having multiple breeding females. Once you start to follow individuals, you realize the extent to which their social life is affected by the structure of their society and the extent to which the structure of their society affects so much that's going on. So let me give you a very brief introduction to the structure of mammalian societies. First of all, there are a number of promiscuous societies, some in which males and females have quite separate ranges, like the northern red squirrels, and where mating is essentially random. Then there are a number of societies where males and females make up monogamous pairs, very often mating with each other for life. Moving on, there are polygynous societies where females live in some group, some form of group. The typical situation for meerkat, for them, is that females grow up in a group and stay in the group throughout their lives, and groups of females are defended by a single male. And in most of those cases, as I say, females remain in the group, so you have a group of female relatives with an immigrant male that looks after them. And then you have a pile of bachelors who are excluded from the system. But in some species, females habitually leave. These are particularly interesting. In these species, females habitually disperse when they reach adolescence. They include a small minority of species, but some very important species, mostly equids, a number of primates, a number of tropical bats, and most interestingly, all the great apes. The great apes are habitual female dispersers. There you commonly get a group of unrelated females who are defended by a single male. If you get big groups of females, you commonly get them being defended by more than one male. So many of the baboons and macaques, you get multiple males who are commonly immigrants, and they have, in most of these cases, immigrated independently, so you have unrelated males defending a group of basically related females. Most of these species, again, females remain in their natal group. But in some cases, you get females dispersing at adolescence, in particular as in the great apes, and in some of these, you get related males staying behind, so you have related males. And those aspects of kinship are important. Moving on, you have a minority, an even smaller number, of cooperative breeders where typically one dominant female monopolizes reproduction. So one female is the mother of virtually all the offspring, and then you have a number of non-breeders, maybe in some cases of both sexes, in some cases of one sex, who actually rear her offspring. The meerkats we work on are one of the best known examples of this for mammals. The interesting thing of these species are they are in essence on the way to the eusocial species of ants and wasps, where you get much larger colonies, but again a single breeding female assisted by a caste of workers that may be hundreds of thousands strong, and typically again a relationship between that female and a single male. So the cooperative breeders are on the way to eusociality. Now, I've spelled out to you the major contrasts in animal society, in mammalian societies. And the thing I want to stress now is those contrasts affect almost everything about mammals that you can think of. They affect the frequency, nature, and form of competition between individuals, which is strongly affected by whether they're polygynous or monogamous. They affect the intensity and direction of almost all selection pressures on males and females. They affect the evolution and development of most anatomical, physiological, and behavioral traits in both sexes, and they affect the responses of individuals to variation in environmental conditions and management. And also understanding those relationships between society and the characteristics of males and females provides us with some insight into the evolution of human behavior. So I'm going to talk about these relationships today, and I'm going to try and join up the dots for mammals. So the topics that I'm going to be covering are diverse, and I'm going to be trying to give you some idea of how they relate to each other. Before I do that, I should say something briefly about how we go about this. There are really three strands to the analysis of animal societies and their consequences. The first is a sociological approach where people have related variation in social structure to variation in ecology. This was started by, I should have introduced. This is the structure of what I'm going to say. I'm going to talk about the evolution of mammalian societies, and then I'm going to talk about the effects of social organization on selection on males, male life histories, female tactics, female kinship, and I'm going to end up with cooperation. And then I'm going to raise the question, what, if anything, all this has to tell us about the evolution of human societies. Before I do that, I want to say something about how we approach societies. The early stages related variation in social behavior to variation in food, ecology, and susceptibility to predation. This is called a socio-ecological approach, started by John Crook from the University of Bristol, who related variation in the size of bird colonies to the kinds of habitats they lived in. Subsequently, various people pointed out that genetic relationships and the determinants of fitness were important. This was very much an area of endeavor based quite extensively in the States, but it included people like Bill Hamilton and Bob Trivers from Harvard, who argued, and E.O. Wilson too, who argued that genetics played a major important role, and in particular, kin factors played an important role in understanding these relationships too. And the third line of endeavor is a comparatively recent one, and that is with the advent of extensive gene-based phylogenies, we've been able to set up phylogenetic relationships between different species and ask questions about sequences of the evolution of different social traits and the circumstances under which they evolved. So that we can, for example, we can take a basic phylogeny, which is a gene-based phylogeny, which gives us a timing and a sequence for the evolution of different species. We can throw onto that the different traits. In this case, I've thrown onto it the evolution of cooperative breeding in red, the evolution of monogamy in black, and we can ask questions about the early evolution, the sequences of evolution of relationships between the evolution of monogamy and the evolution of cooperative breeding. I'm just using that as one example. We could do that for any other trait, but here we can show, for example, that this is data for the marmosets and tamarins. All these species have cooperative breeding, though one appears to have lost it. The condition for these, shared with night monkeys, is one of monogamy. So what one can say is that cooperative breeders are derived from a monogamous ancestor. And you can play that game very widely with any selection of traits. I think the only other thing I should say, since I missed it, is that our general understanding of animal systems is that females are distributed in relation to food, and so females distribute themselves in relation to resources that they can turn into offspring, and males distribute themselves largely in relation to females. So we see a situation where if females are clumped, the males aggregate with them and defend them, and if females are dispersed, the males are dispersed with particular females. So using these three approaches and extensively using phylogenetic regression, which is a comparatively recent situation, we can ask what the ancestral condition, when mammals first evolved, what was the nature of their societies. And here it's quite clear that mammals are derived from nocturnal ancestors, and that the first mammals were species where both males and females were largely solitary for most of their time. And many nocturnal species today follow that pattern. So the ancestral condition for mammals is the females occupying solitary ranges and then males defending territories overlapping the ranges of multiple females. And societies of that kind are found in a wide variety of nocturnal mammals, but also quite a wide variety of rodents, including quite a wide variety of carnivores and a number of primates. So that's the ancestral condition for mammals. In some species, from this condition, evolved monogamous species. So like gibbons or a number of other species, these are a monogamous antelope, dictic. So from this original condition evolved a number of monogamous species. And these are species typically where the density of females is low, where overlap between female ranges is low, and these are caused by relatively specialized diets. So for example, the gibbons are ripe fruit eaters, so there's relatively low density of gibbons. Now, not all of these species show extensive paternal care, but quite a number of them also show males play a major role in helping to rear the offspring as well as females. And so one of the questions that's been asked is the evolution of monogamy driven by paternal care? This particularly came from work on birds, where people thought that they were monogamous because males were needed to help rear young. So we can use phylogenetic regression to ask the question, is it the case that that paternal care preceded the evolution of monogamy, so that paternal care, the need for paternal care, selected for the evolution of monogamy? The answer is no. So is monogamy a response to the selection of paternal care? No. Monogamy usually precedes the evolution of paternal care, as I showed you in the primate example that I started off with. All both evolve at the same point. There's one other idea, which is monogamy as a response to the need for protection against male infanticide. That's in a sense a specialized form of paternal care. The argument is that if you're susceptible to another incoming male killing your baby, you need to stay with your female and protect her. And there's no obvious association equally that we can find between the evolution of monogamy and the evolution of infanticide. Conversely, as expected, there is a relationship between the evolution of monogamy and the density of females. So as population density goes up, the probability of the evolution of monogamy goes down. So monogamy is associated with low female density and with problems of males in defending more than one female at a time. In a sense, I wanted to get monogamy out of the way because I will actually come back to it, because I really want to talk about societies where females live in groups. Females live in groups, typically because grouping gives them either partial protection against predation, because it gives them access to resources, or because it gives them improved competitive ability to keep their neighbors out of their hair and out of their ranges. And as I've already told you, females living in groups form two sorts of groups: related females with a male, as in colobus monkeys or lions or elephants, and then a small number of species where females habitually disperse at adolescence, where you have one or more males plus a pile of unrelated females who have immigrated into the group, who've left their natal group. I want to just briefly talk about the consequences of polygyny developing. In most of these species where females are social, they're defended either by a single male or multiple males. So you have a group of females defended by a single male, which is commonly a harem formation. What that inevitably leads to is a situation where many males are excluded from breeding. They're not able to breed, and that leads to intense competition from the individuals that have been excluded to topple the resident male. So if there are lots of bachelor males, they're waiting in the wings to take over, and they're commonly challenging the resident male. And polygyny intensifies male-male competition. So as you run into polygyny, you get a high incidence of male-male competition and a high incidence of fights. One of the consequences of that is that increases selection on males for traits that increase competitive ability. So where you have a situation where males fight commonly, as in red deer, and the size of body size affects your success in fights, as it does in many animals that fight by pushing, you commonly have a situation like this, where if you regress breeding success, you look at the relationship between breeding success and body size, you have a steeper slope for males than females. This is an idealized data relationship. We find that with red deer where we have long-term data. Body size matters more to males than it does to females because males are continuously having to fight for access to breed. And that leads in turn to the evolution of traits in males that increase their competitive ability. So it's unsurprising that as you get more polygynous species, as harem size, as the size of female groups increases, sexual dimorphism in size increases. So that if you look at the seals, the land-breeding seals like elephant seals, the males are a lot larger than females, and as you move down to the species that breed on pack ice, where females are much more widely distributed, males don't fight so much, harems are much smaller, there's not so much competition for males, and you don't get so much increase in body size. Now, I don't want to go on with this is all very old hat, but there are some consequences of this which are worth noting. So it doesn't just affect size, it affects selection on a wide variety of other traits. So where you get polygyny developing and generating intense competition between males, not only are males larger, but they have larger weaponry and more ornamentation. Partly because of their greater growth, they have higher metabolic needs, so males for their body weight require more nutrition. I spent quite a bit of my time working on the effects of this, on the costs of raising sons and daughters, and in these polygynous species in red deer we were able to show that mothers who had raised a son were twice as likely to die the following winter as mothers that had raised a daughter. And if they didn't die, they were less likely to breed again. It also leads to circumstances where juvenile mortality is higher in males because of their greater metabolic needs, so that if you have faced starvation, then males are much more likely to die as juveniles than females, and that extends into adult life. So in many human populations that are starving, you get much higher mortality of males than females. The classic example is the Donner or the Donner Party, who were caught in the Sierra Nevadas and forced to overwinter, where almost all the males died before the women started to die in the group. And it affects aging and longevity of males, as I'll come on to in a moment. Beyond this, partly because of this, because of the consequences of competition for males, the degree of polygyny and the intensity of competition that go with it affect many aspects of male life histories. And I want to go into this because this has ramifying consequences for the behavior of females and the structure of groups. So polygyny and competition associated with it affects paternity and skew. It affects the proportion of resident females that a male can mate with. As the number of females in his harem goes up, his paternity certainty goes down. It affects the duration for which a male can continue to breed. So breeding tenure is the number of years consecutively that a male can breed in, and that declines rapidly as harem size increases. When male tenure is very short and males come into a group and their tenure is unlikely to be long, and they commonly face a situation where many of the females are pregnant, or have lactating young, they commonly kill young born into the group to accelerate the process. This is a process that Sarah Hrdy has originally discovered in langurs and has shown to be very widespread. The relationships between males affect their tolerance, so as I'll go on to that, and it affects the reproductive anatomy, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But just to give you an idea of the kinds of effects of male competition, here is the breeding success of male and female red deer being the same as your elk. And the only point I want to make here is that the breeding success of males is clustered in a very small number of years. So males only breed in many of these species in 3 or 4 years during their lifespan. In some of these species, males only breed successfully once in their lifespan. So male reproduction is very compressed. So the turnover of males is very high. And this is commonly associated with male longevity being shorter than female longevity. So one of the other aspects of polygynous societies is that males age faster and die younger than females. Now, selection on males operates through lifetime reproductive success. So these reductions in tenure and paternity certainty threaten the reproductive success of males. The more females that a male defends, the shorter his reproductive tenure. So this is comparative data for mammals looking at mean male tenure length in year relative to interbirth intervals in females to standardize it as the number of females per group increases. So that as the harem size, the potential harem size increases, there's a drastic reduction in the relative length of male tenure. It's also the case that as harem size increases and male tenure declines, the probability of infanticide, of male infanticide, rises. I'm not going to show you data here, but there's a close relationship between the distribution of male infanticide and short male tenure, which we've recently demonstrated by a comparative analysis for all mammals. So it's very important for males to maximize their tenure length, to maximize it's not just that they need to make sure that they get the maximum number of females, they've also got to do that for as long as possible in their lifetimes. So what we've recently been able to show is that one of the major factors in extending your tenure length, or you are able to extend your tenure length by tolerating other males. So that if we look again at relative male tenure length here, for single male species and multi-male species, by tolerating another male in the group, you substantially increase your tenure length. So you substantially increase your lifetime reproductive success. So having other males around has huge benefits for male tenure because they assist each other in keeping other males out. But it has costs too, because if you have other mature males in the group, it's going to be difficult for you to ensure that they don't get access to your females. And it's typically the case that as male tenure length, as the number of resident adult males increases, so paternity certainty drops. And males have to take measures to cope with this. One of the measures they take, one of the situations they take, is that commonly in these circumstances, females mate with multiple males. So males are facing a situation where their sperm is not the only sperm inside the female at the same time, because the female is mating with several males. So they're in a situation where they want to maximize their chances of fertilizing. And this has been likened to a raffle. So you're winning the raffle is equivalent to fertilizing the female. And how do you make sure you win a raffle? The answer is you take as many tickets in it as you can. And what males do under these circumstances is to produce very large ejaculates, large numbers of sperm. And one of the correlates of this is that males have very large testes. So these are all mammals where males face strong competition, strong sperm competition, because there are multiple males around. Females mate with multiple males, and males have huge testes in these species. So if you look at chimps. This is work partly done by Sandy Harcourt, who's here tonight, who was one of the first people who showed this consistent relationship between the size of testes in mammals and the probability that females will mate with multiple males. Testis size is not the only adaptation. So males show large testes where multiple males may get access to the female. There are also other correlates in terms of sperm structure, long sperm midpieces, rapid spermatogenesis, they produce sperm fast, high sperm densities, fast seminal coagulation, so they block the female tract after they're mated, and it's sometimes associated with female ornamentation too. Now, the duration of male tenure and female sociality, the degree of competition between males, and its effects on male tenure have other important consequences for females. In particular, they have a major effect on female dispersal and thus on kinship structure. So male tenure has a strong effect on female dispersal and philopatry. This affects female kinship to a substantial extent, and female kinship affects social relationships within and between groups and the extent of reproductive cooperation. So now we're going to be going on looking at how variation in male life histories associated with polygyny affects the structure of relationships between females. Short male tenure allows females to remain in their natal group throughout their lives. And that's because where males have short tenure, the probability of a resident daughter reaching breeding age when her father is still the resident breeding male is relatively low. Long male tenure raises a problem for females, and the problem is that they may mature when their father is the resident breeding male, and they need to breed with an unrelated partner. So what one might expect is that male tenure that is longer than the female age at first breeding is associated with female dispersal, and that these are the species where females typically live. And that vice versa, females remain in their group, because that's the safest thing to do, if male tenure is shorter than female age at first breeding. We were able to show that there is indeed a consistent relationship across mammals between male tenure length relative to female age at first breeding and whether females leave the group or not. So that if for mammals you plot male tenure length against female age at first breeding for species which habitually disperse at adolescence versus those which habitually stay and breed in their natal group, the species which habitually leave at adolescence have longer male tenure than female age at first breeding in virtually all these cases. And these are the relatively small number of species, as I said, the social equids, some bats, and all the great apes. And in all of these, the tenure of either individual breeding males or male kin groups substantially exceeds the age of females at first reproduction, generating a problem that females need to leave the group to breed with their dads, to avoid breeding with their dads. So as in all these species, females leave, and as a result, you have female groups which consist of unrelated females, whereas in these you have groups which consist of related females. Now that's very important because in these groups, the females are unrelated to each other, they're not close kin, they're typically not familiar with each other either. Here you have females that are closely related to each other, which are close kin, and they know each other well. So that affects the average kinship of female group members. It's not the only factor affecting average kinship. Other factors affecting the average kinship within groups are the number of breeding females. So the more different females that breed, the lower the average kinship. The number of males that breed and the degree of skew, the higher the number of males and the lower the degree of skew, the lower the relatedness between individuals. And female fecundity, if it's the case that females produce quite large pulses of young which move through the group quite fast, you have a situation where a lot of individuals are full sibs, they've been fathered by the same male, whereas if, as in the great apes, females produce young at long intervals, the average relatedness between group members tends to be very low. Of these, the number of breeding females is particularly important. So as you have more female breeders in a group, so the average coefficient of relatedness drops down. So with group size, you typically have a relatively high relatedness between group members. As you move to larger breeding groups, the average relatedness between group members falls. Male factors are important too. So look, as I've already told you, with polygynous species, paternity certainty is relatively low. In monogamous species, paternity certainty is relatively high. So here, more individuals are going to share the same father. Again, male tenure is involved. So with monogamous species, males have quite long tenure. So individuals born into successive years are relatively likely to share the same father. With polygyny, you have a high turnover of males. You're going to get different males fertilizing. You may well get multiple females with different fathers in different cohorts. These, in conjunction, have really substantial effects on average kinship within groups. So let me just show you something about the variation in average kinship between groups. Now, if you look at the primates, like baboons or macaques, these are species where females habitually remain in their natal group throughout their lives. But even though they're all related, because all the females remain in the natal group throughout their lives, the degree of kinship between these is very, very low. Now, there's been a tendency for people to suppose that where females are philopatric and remain in the same group throughout their lives, kinship is quite high. The answer is it really isn't. Kinship, the average kinship between these and between individuals and baboons and macaques is quite low. And that's partly because multiple females breed. It's partly because multiple males breed. It's partly because male tenure is relatively short. And it's partly because females produce single young at long intervals, so relatively few individuals in the group have the same mother. Now move to a situation in lions, where again, females remain in their natal pride, so they're equivalent here. There are multiple males breeding, as here, but females produce litters, and they produce litters which commonly share the same father. So there are a relatively high proportion of full siblings in lion groups and a substantial increase in average relatedness. Now move on to meerkats, where a single female breeds, mated to a single male. A monogamous breeding system is associated with high paternity certainty and long male tenure. And you move to a situation where the high proportion of individuals are full sibs, and therefore you have high levels of average relatedness to each other. Now this affects social relationships between females in the same group and between males and females in neighboring groups. So where you get to a situation where females are close kin, it's typically associated, you have affiliative relationships if they're kin with each other, and you get them being nice to each other. Typically, where females are kin and they're familiar, they resist immigration by unrelated females very strongly. You get a similar situation in males. So as in chimpanzees, if males are close kin, where males remain in the natal group, males tend to tolerate each other, but they're intensely hostile towards males from different groups. there are other factors here too. If, as in baboons, you get a high degree, you get relatively low average relatedness, they're all related, they're all familiar with each other, but you have low average relatedness and high variance, you then get discrimination, social discrimination between relatives. So this is grooming data showing that the extent of association between females is closely related to the degree of kinship. As you move up the average degree of kinship, so the degree of discrimination goes down because everyone is closely related and everyone is consequently nice to each other. It's also the case that the variance, the average degree of kinship and variance in kinship affects the extent to which they make coalitions and alliances between individuals to compete with other members of the same group. So where you get individuals that are distantly, where average relatedness is low, even if they are all familiar and related and females are philopatric, they commonly form coalitions, whereas in animals like meerkats, where they're all closely related, they all have common interests and they don't compete with each other to the same extent. So in a number of species, they form coalitions. These are temporary alliances which are used against each other. They can either be conservative, which are used to suppress lower rivals of lower dominance rank, or revolutionary, rather more complicated form of coalition, where two individuals ally to topple an individual that's dominant to both of them. The point, I think, is that where individuals have high kinship, you don't find coalitions. So in small groups where kinship is high, you don't get coalitions at all. As the group size increases and average kinship falls, you're more likely to get coalitions of one kind or another, but the most complex forms of coalitions, the revolutionary coalitions between individuals, are found in groups where the average kinship is lowest. I'll be coming back to the relevance of this in a moment. Now, the degree of kinship also affects the extent of reproductive cooperation. If you are close kin to individuals, you're much more likely to cooperate with them. There are two sorts of cooperation, reproductive cooperation found in mammals. So in some species where females are philopatric, they share care of young. So in lionesses, females lactate, they jointly lactate their young. You find a similar situation in some mice. Now here, different females, the females that are cooperating with each other, are related, but they're gaining mutual benefits from doing this. Both individuals benefit by sharing care of young. And situations of that kind are not difficult to understand, and they're not restricted to species with high coefficients of relatedness. Both individuals are getting a benefit from sharing young, so they don't need to do it with relatives. So communal breeders are species where females share care of young, gain a benefit from doing so. They're quite commonly related to each other, but they don't need to be related to each other very closely. I now want to fall back to the last category of species, of societies that I talked about, and these are cooperative breeders. Meerkats that I work on are one of the examples. Now here, one female is responsible for almost all the breeding, and other individuals help to rear her young. Other mammals that breed in this way are the mole rats, Damaraland and naked mole rats. Again, one female breeds, everyone else looks after her young. Now this raises an obvious question, which I'll be talking about in more detail in my next lecture, is what's in it for these individuals? They spend, in some cases, all their lives raising young produced by a different female. Now these species commonly have very complex forms of cooperation, so meerkats do a lot of different cooperative things, and individuals are maybe helpers for most of their lives, and in fact, most individuals never get to breed successfully. These species are derived exclusively, as far as we can see, from monogamous ancestors, so that the promiscuous original ancestral state gives way to monogamy, and these cooperative breeders are all derived from monogamous ancestors. Communal breeders, as I told you just now, where individuals gain mutual benefits, can be derived either from monogamous or from polygynous ancestors. Now, in these species, and I've already described to you the meerkat situation in some detail, there is a very high degree of relatedness in all species where we can see this happening. So typically in meerkats, you have a single female mated with a single male with high paternity certainty and long male tenure. The female produces a litter of young, so multiple females, multiple offspring that all share the same father, with the result that the average degree of relatedness between group members is vastly higher. It's around 4 times that found in baboons and macaques, where also females remain in the group, but the situation doesn't favor the evolution of close kinship. And the suggested explanation why it is the case that cooperative breeders are confined to monogamous ancestors was produced by Koos Boomsma, and he points out, using kin selection theory, that in these situations where you have a monogamous society, you have a situation where SIBs, where an individual is closely related to the subsequent offspring of its parents. Commonly they are full SIBs with a degree of relatedness of around 0.5, which is roughly equivalent to its own relatedness to its own offspring. So in this situation, it's equivalent. In practice, this value may often be somewhat lower than this, but this can be compensated if your mother is much more successful, much more likely to breed successfully than you are. So in these circumstances, if the individuals that your mother is producing are as closely related to you as your own offspring, and your mother is much more likely to breed successfully than you are, it's likely to be in your interest to help your mother rather than to breed yourself. So I'll be talking about the costs and benefits of cooperation, of cooperative breeding in my next lecture. The point that I want to make here is that this situation only occurs under a situation of monogamy, where the incidence of full SIBs is very high. So I've now taken you over a quick distribution of mammalian societies and their consequences, and I just want to end with raising the question of what relevance this has, if any, to our understanding of human societies and human ancestry. And people have been interested in this, and mammalian people working on mammals have been interested in this for some time. There's much to cover here. I really want to make 3 points. Firstly, our understanding of the relationships between polygyny and the extent of various sex differences strongly suggests that the ancestral condition in which humans evolved is one of polygyny. So here are some of the traits shared by modern humans, in some degree, with other polygynous mammals. Sexual size dimorphism: males are larger than females. Males have larger canine teeth relative to their body size than females in humans. Males have increased male growth rate. It's questionable as to whether the costs of raising sons and daughters are different or not. Sexual dimorphism is not that high, but it's there. Increased juvenile mortality in males, particularly under circumstances of starvation. Earlier aging and shorter lifespans in males. That's an interesting thought, I think, that the tendency for males to die earlier, to age faster and die earlier, is part of the signature of past polygyny, and you don't find it in properly monogamous species. And then a question as to female-biased adult sex ratios in high-density populations. So our ancestors were polygynous, and the fossil record supports this. So the degree of sexual dimorphism has declined in time, and if we plot it for the different categories of humans, if we plot the degree of dimorphism from parity, from inequality here to a situation up here with gorillas where they're twice as heavy as females, we've shown that the early species showed much higher degrees of dimorphism, and dimorphism has declined over time. We don't understand why it has declined, and there may be various explanations of that. It could be that polygyny has declined, but it could also be that body size, the selection for male size has declined as males have come to rely more and more either on alliances with each other or on weapons. But fairly clearly, the early species were more dimorphic and more polygynous. And this raises another question. Is it the case that humans evolved as unimale harem species in which sperm competition was uncommon, or did they perhaps evolve like chimpanzees in a situation where males were facing competition with each other within the group and sperm competition was common? The answer here is less certain, but it looks as if, in general, we have the traits of a unimale species. We have comparatively small testes, much smaller than chimpanzees relative. We have comparatively short we have comparatively short sperm midpieces. We don't have rapid spermatogenesis. We don't have high sperm densities, and we don't have fast seminal coagulation. So most of the traits that we can see look as if they're associated with unimale societies and low sperm competition. And I want to end by just discussing our third characteristic. One of the great characteristics of humans is the extent of cooperation. So if we compare human societies with animal societies, there's an enormous difference in the extent and complexity and cost of cooperation, particularly between unrelated individuals. So if you take any hunter-gatherer society, or indeed any modern society, cooperation is common. We rely on cooperation throughout our lives, and we cooperate both with unfamiliar and unrelated individuals. So a number of people have looked at the patterns of cooperation and their relationship to kinship. In most human communities, like many of the higher primates, the degree of kinship between group members is very low. So the number of close kin, of primary kin, parents and full sibs, is very low. Even primary and distant kin, these are data for Ache Indians, are typically very low. We live in communities with individuals that are either distantly related or unrelated to us. But despite that, we go on for close competition. We go on for extensive cooperation. Now, how did this all evolve, and what role did cooperation play in human evolution? Now, one suggestion is that the sequence of events followed this pattern. You originally had a clever ape, the evolution of something like a chimpanzee, and the ape evolved cooperative breeding. So the suggestion here, which is produced by and supported by a number of people, is that the sequence of events with humans, we developed a clever ape, and that suddenly became a cooperative breeder. So it moved into a situation where lots of individuals were assisting individuals in rearing young. And the suggestion is that this degree of alloparental care reduced the energetic costs of pregnancy to females, and so reduced constraints on the evolution of large brains. Large brains are energetically costly to maintain. And the suggestion is that increased brain size and improved cognitive development led to further increases in cooperation and in all the wide range of human traits. I think there are problems in this sort of account of the evolution of human behavior. One of them is that the apes are the wrong kinds of animals to have evolved cooperative breeders. They're highly polygynous. There's no female reproductive suppression, so all the females breed. female dispersal and immigration, and as a result of all this, there are very low levels of kinship, comparatively little cooperation between females, and single young are produced at long intervals. And for someone like me who works with a highly cooperative species like meerkats, the great apes, and indeed most of the primates, don't really look very cooperative at all. They look highly competitive animals who are continuously trying to get at each other, who sometimes form alliances which are useful in a political sense, but they don't look like animals that cooperate very extensively. Another problem, I think, with this is that cooperation doesn't necessarily reduce the energetic costs of breeding and so release brain size, because in cooperative breeders they increase their degree of fecundity. So in most cooperative breeders, they increase the frequency of breeding and litter size so that the costs of breeding actually go up. So here's a comparison of just two cooperative species, meerkats, mole rats, both cooperative breeders. They typically produce multiple litters a year of big litters and produce vast numbers of offspring during their lives. So that the costs of breeding are not reduced by the degree of alloparental care. A third problem, I think, with this is it really isn't the case that cooperative breeders and a high degree of breeding are very clever. On the whole, cooperative breeders are rather dumb, meerkats included. So that cooperative breeders, like the social insects, like the cooperative birds and meerkats and mole rats, typically don't have big brains. They typically have rather small brains, not big brains. So all of these, I think, argue against it. Now, we have become interested in another possibility, and we started by another way. If one identifies the mammals, which one takes and thinks as clever, here are a collection of them. The higher primates are clever, the apes, and the baboons and macaques, the cetaceans, and some of the carnivores, like these spotted hyenas. And all these have large brains for their body size. The common characteristic of these is not an extensive degree of cooperation. The common characteristic of these is that they all live in stable groups where average kinship is very low. So all of these animals live throughout their lives and are forced to compete throughout their lives with other individuals in the same group to whom they are distantly related or unrelated. And in the middle, we are working on this at the moment. These are incidentally the species that form long and extensive alliances so that they form complex short-term alliances between relatives or between relatives, which perhaps generate some degree of social complexity. But what we can find is that if one's interested in relative brain size, and one believes that that is in some sense related cognitive ability, relative brain size decreases as average kinship increases. So the clever animals with big brains are those where average kinship within groups is quite low. So we're moving to an alternative suggestion that the evolution of large brains and of human cognitive abilities is associated with large stable groups of low relatedness. This leads to complex social competition between unrelated group members, and that perhaps leads to action for increased brain size and improved cognitive abilities. My guess would be that it's these consequences of increased brain size and improved cognitive abilities that eventually lead through to the evolution of language and cooperation. I think we don't know when language evolved. We have no direct no knowledge of its relationship to cooperation, but my temptation would be to believe that extensive human cooperation is a consequence of language, and the language has allowed us to make agreements and contracts with each other in a way that other mammals can't. And it's these social contracts and agreements that have played an enormous role in the evolution of complex forms of cooperation. and that much human cooperation is enforced by social norms and enforced through social mechanisms. So if one looks at the various sorts of ways that are used to force people to cooperate in one context or another, they're mostly related to language or social enforcement. So we've got Lenin persuading people. We've got markets where individuals make agreements to exchange. We've got enforcement through formal, informal mechanisms, such as the white feathers given to men that didn't go to the front in the First World War, or then we have firing squads used to deal with deserters. I think all of these depend on the evolution of social contracts, of agreements between group members, for which there are no parallels in other mammals, and that they ultimately depend on our capacity to make agreements, which can really only be made with language. And this isn't a particularly novel view. If one looks, it's a view that goes back to Darwin, who believed that language was indeed the origin of much of male competition. So just to summarize quickly from what I've said of the course that I've taken, the central condition for mammals is one where both sexes are solitary and occupy overlapping ranges. Females of some species form stable groups consisting either of natal animals or immigrants which are defended by multiple males. Polygyny increases the intensity of male competition, the degree of differences in size and growth, but reduces male breeding tenure and length. Males can increase their breeding tenure and success by tolerating and associating with each other. Though there are problems, this affects male skew because females get to breed with multiple partners. Female sociality and polygyny both reduce average kinship between group members, as does female emigration, which occurs where male tenure is relatively long, members with consequences for social relationships between and with groups. While mutualistic cooperation is common, even in species where average relatedness is relatively low, altruistic cooperation, non-breeders helping breeders, is confined to species where kinship is high. And here, some thoughts, some guesses. Humans probably evolved as a polygynous species, may have lived in single male groups. While communal breeding could have evolved in an early stage of human evolution, it's unlikely that hominins evolved as cooperative breeders in the way that I've defined them, or that cooperation was responsible for the evolution of increased cognitive abilities. Alternative possibility, it seems to us, is that life in stable groups where individuals aren't closely related to each other and they're forced to compete with each other throughout their lifespans has led to the evolution of complex shifting alliances which have led to the development of our cognitive ability and the evolution of language and eventually of increased brain size. So thank you very much for listening.
Would you like to take questions? Are there questions? Yes. Yes.
Me? I didn't understand the relationship between increased polygyny and increasing female ornamentation.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
I didn't understand the association between increased polygyny and increased female ornamentation.
Increased female?
Ornamentation.
Okay, I didn't go into that. The suggestion is that multi-male systems favor increased female ornamentation because females are seeking to mate with multiple partners in the group.
Yes,
Take your graph of male tenure against female age of first breeding. You had
Yes.
2 crosses that were above the line. You didn't say anything about it. In other words, in the wrong place. Who were they? Why were they there?
I think one are Cebus monkeys. They are both, I think, I honestly forget what the second one is. One are Capuchin monkeys, I think, where groups are relatively big and there is a diversity of immigrants and non-immigrant males in the group, so that females have access to other cases despite being that. I forget what the other species is, but again, I think it's a similar situation. If you are living in a group where you can actually breed with unrelated group members in the same group, then you're fine and you can stay there.
Do you think that the comparison between species could be applied to intraspecific variation, for instance, between population, where the life expectancy is shorter because, I don't know, the environment, you would have this correlation with the reproduction, or even between individuals who show consistent life history traits that will affect their breeding duration, male tenure track, and so on?
I think a lot of the relationships that I've shown you have parallels within species. So that, for example, the relationship between male tenure and harem size applies within species too, and that individuals who have relatively large harems tend to have relatively short tenure. However, I think there is quite a real problem in a lot of cases because the relationships that you see within species are commonly associated with differences in population density and resource availability, which affect many of the reproductive and longevity variables. So if you're looking at differences between species, you're looking hopefully mostly at adaptive differences that are a consequence of evolution. Where you're looking at differences within species or different either between individuals or populations, there's a danger that what you're looking at is ecological variation, which is affected by either spatial or temporal differences in resource availability and population density. So I think that it's not one shouldn't expect to find all the same relationships operating at an intraspecific level. I think they sometimes do and they sometimes don't, and I think what you commonly have to do is to explore those relationships with experiments within species, and I'll be talking a bit about that in the particular context of cooperative breeding tomorrow.
Thanks a lot for that, Tim. That was great. On the origins of cooperation in language, I find it very plausible that in contemporary human societies, of course, language is extremely important for enabling cooperation, but I have a hard time understanding how it could arise without cooperation in the first place, because human language is cheap talk, and people are extremely vulnerable to having unpleasant images installed in their heads by casual sound waves. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think there may have been...
Summarize the question.
Sorry?
Can you quickly summarize the question, please?
Is it really the case that language could have evolved without some form of cooperation during the process of its evolution? And I totally agree with that. I certainly meant to, I'm aware one of the slides just doesn't. I was specifically talking about reproductive cooperation. Yeah. Now, you don't have to have reproductive cooperation to get other forms of cooperation. My guess would be that the evolution of language was wrapped up with the evolution of foraging cooperation, perhaps hunting cooperation, perhaps cooperative defense, and so on. It's specifically the evolution of altruistic reproductive cooperation that I think is rather unlikely. So I'm entirely of the belief that cooperation probably has a very ancient history, but that doesn't necessarily mean that reproductive cooperation has a long history. And if you look at mammals, extensive reproductive cooperation is confined to really a rather small number of species. The altruistic forms of reproductive cooperation are confined effectively to monogamous species, and it seems to me very unlikely that they were highly developed in humans.
One more question in the back there.
Yes, Tim, you talked about, obviously, the ecological bases for the distributions of the sexes, especially distributions of females, and then the consequences of that for male options, male behavior, and then from your own work, the ensuing consequences, some of which would be coevolutionary among males and females. So to focus further on consequences of breeding systems, in the ecological context, do you think there's any productive speculation possible, say, about resilience of groups in the face of anthropogenic fragmentation of populations, changes in gene flow, changes in variability of food availability that can be predicted, the probability of productive innovation based upon a breeding system alone?
I think to try and put that in a simple nutshell, I think the question is it the case that the contrasts in breeding systems and social systems I've talked about have ecological consequences? And specifically, do they have ecological consequences in relation to population resilience? I think that's a huge topic, and I think that one of the most interesting areas in population dynamics actually concerns the consequences of contrasting breeding systems for the form of population regulation and for the form of population dynamics. So I'm entirely of the same opinion that I think is driving your question. The answer, I think, straightforwardly is we don't know relatively much about this, and there's been comparatively little work on the effect of breeding systems on population dynamics. And that's partly because the relevant data to look at the effect on population dynamics on the whole isn't there. We don't have long-term studies of population dynamics for many species. What I'd give you would be two cases. Firstly, I think cooperative breeding may have a major effect. And cooperative breeding leads to a situation where low population density generates low recruitment levels. And that's because cooperative breeders don't breed effectively in small groups. So if you, with a cooperative breeder, if you get a disease running through or a bad year which knocks down group size, the breeding success of those residual groups is low, not high. So it generates alley effects and inverse density dependence, which are more likely to lead to population extinction. The other case that I would emphasize, where I think the kinds of things I've been talking about are important, concerns the management of particularly ungulate populations, but the management of populations where the income from management is from the offtake of males. Now, if you're managing a deer population and you want to produce as many males as you can, because males are what people pay to shoot for whatever reason, what you want is a regular production of males. Now, the problem is that quite a lot of managers have believed that they get most shootable males by having the greatest number of females. And the problem is that's not right. If you allow your female numbers to go to carrying capacity, you get increased mortality in males, you get increased emigration in males, and incidentally you get prenatal mortality and a female bias sex ratio as well. So if you've got a deer population which is subject to the kinds of sort of circumstances I've been talking about, you've got to keep your female numbers down to actually, from our modeling, around 50% of ecological carrying capacity. Otherwise, the number of males that you can shoot is lower. So I think there are interesting implications there. And incidentally, the worst case for a manager of a deer population is to not shoot your females and to be next door to someone who is shooting their females because all your males go next door. So that I think it does have management implications. I haven't talked about this because I've been really wanting to talk about the evolutionary consequences of different breeding systems, but I think it's absolutely the case that the different breeding systems have very important implications for population dynamics, but as yet, sadly, I think our understanding of those relationships is very piecemeal.
I think Tim has deserved a glass of wine. Thank you very much.